Hello and welcome to the Jazz Jam Podcast. I'm your host, Dwayne Gunnels, joined by my co-host, Max Levy. And on today's episode, we're going to be getting into a newer album by Immanuel Wilkins, his second Blue Note release entitled The Seventh Hand, which was released back in January of this year. So pretty excited to see what Immanuel Wilkins has in store for us. He's an up-and-coming younger cat. So yeah, I'm excited to get into it. But before we get into it, instead of doing really a jazz question of the week, I figured we'd switch it up a little bit, and we're going to hit Max with a jazz questions of the week and do a jazz trivia quiz for Max this week. Max, how are you feeling about this quiz I'm about to hit you with?
I'm really scared. I'm going to look like a dummy, but I'm ready, and it'll probably be some interesting questions, and it'll probably cover a lot of different topics all at once. So I'm kind of excited, but at the same time anxious and worried I will not look so great.
I have faith in you. I think you're going to get, if you get more than half of them, that's got to be like a success, I feel like. Unless it were like jazz history class, then that would not be good. But let's go ahead and get right into it with the first question. Are you ready, Max?
As ready as I can possibly be.
They are multiple choice, so that's got to help. All right.
Thank God.
The first question is, the famous Bill Evans Trio's live recording that produced Sunday at the Village Vanguard and Waltz for Debbie was recorded in what year? 1960, 1961, 1959, or 1962?
Well, I'm not a huge listener of the great Bill Evans. I should listen to more of them, and this will remind me to do so. So I'm going to go with...
These are also close together, too.
They are, and that's also why it's a hard question, because a lot of great records came out during that time. I'm going to go in 1961.
Okay, that sounds pretty good. I guess I don't know the answer to these, so I could try to help you. I was thinking somewhere. They're all so close. I was thinking 59, but I don't actually have.
Well, yeah, that's a good guess. But in 59, a lot of great records came out, including Giant Steps, and there's Dave Brubeck's
Time Out.
Time Out, great.
Yeah.
Just a lot of records came out in that year, and I don't remember, reading anything about Bill Evans's Waltz for Debbie during that specific year, but I could be completely off base.
All right, well, we're going to go with 1961. The second question, this is a good one. What is the best-selling jazz album of all time? Take Five, A Love Supreme, Headhunters, or Kind of Blue? Take Five is not the name of the album, is it?
No. So the best-selling album is Kind of Blue, but the best-selling single is Take Five.
Take Five. Okay.
Kind
of Blue is your...
Kind of Blue is the best-selling jazz album. And so if they're saying the best album, then it is Kind of Blue. But it is a trick question because Take Five is a
That's the only one
single.
That's a song. Yeah, okay. But yeah, it says album, so that's what we're going with. All right. Question number 3. There have been 3... This one's tough. There have been 3 famous jazz musicians with the name Bill Evans. 2 of them, piano and sax, kept their name. What did the third Bill Evans change his name to? Shadow Wilson, Uran Israel, Yusuf Lateef, or Matume?
Those are all great players, and I know those players by those names. I don't know which one was Bill Evans. I'm going to go with Yusuf Lateef.
For some reason, that was like the one, but that's just because I know him the best. But yeah.
And Shadow Wilson is a great drummer, but I don't know if he had a different name than that. Anyway, what's the next question?
This one, if you don't get this one, the podcast is over. Sorry to everyone listening. This is the end.
Oh no!
By what nickname was Ben Webster known? Rabbit.
The Brute.
Okay. I didn't even. Okay, there we go. That was the fourth option. But yes, okay.
That one I don't even have to hear the multiple choice answers to pick from.
The podcast is safe. Everyone, Max got that one with no questions asked. Okay. The fifth question. Although he made his fame and fortune in New York City, where was Duke Ellington born and raised? Chicago, New Orleans, St. Louis, or Washington, D.C.?
Washington, D.C.
Okay. Well, Max sounding confident now.
I know that one, I think.
All right. Paul Desmond, the alto player who played in Dave Brubeck's band for many years, had an agreement with his boss that prevented him from doing what on any of his solo albums. And it's record the song Take 5 on his albums, have a piano player on his albums, play any songs written by Dave Brubeck, or play any classical music written by German composers on this album.
I'm guessing it's either A or C.
Take 5 or do Brubeck songs?
It has to be one of those two. I'm going to go with A.
Take 5?
Yes, but I could be way off base. I don't know.
I've never heard another Paul Desmond Take 5 recording.
Right, that's where I'm going with that. That's my logic on that one. So I'm going to guess A.
Okay, here's another one that I feel like you should get. Question number 7. In the late 50s, early 60s, Art Blakey's Jazz Messengers with Lee Morgan, Bobby Timmons, and Jamie Merritt had a host of tenor sax players who sat in, with some of them only sticking around for 1 or 2 albums. Which of the following tenor players was never in the Jazz Messengers? Wayne Shorter, Hank Mobley, Benny Golson, or Joe Henderson?
Joe Henderson.
Yeah, that's definitely the correct answer there. Okay. I would have gotten that one. What jazz movie starred a host of great jazz musicians, including Dexter Gordon, Herbie Hancock, Bobby Hutcherson, John McLaughlin, and Wayne Shorter? The Cotton Club, Bird, Round Midnight, Lady Sings the Blues.
Well, I know Dexter was in the film Round Midnight. So I'm going to go with Round Midnight.
Okay, I think that's right as well. Oh, Max, it might be. All right. The late, great bass player Ray Brown, love him, he's going to be on our next album, just a hint, was once married to which of the following jazz singers? Billie Holiday, Betty Carter, Sarah Vaughan, or Ella Fitzgerald?
He was married for a short time to Ella Fitzgerald.
Oh, I actually didn't know that.
I'm pretty sure, yeah.
Okay. Which of the following, this is the last question. Max has kind of sped through these, so we'll have to see how accurate he is here. So,
yeah.
Which of the following jazz labels did Lester Koenig found? Contemporary, Candid, Prestige, or Riverside?
Well, it's not Prestige. That was from a guy named Weinstock. Could you repeat those for me one more time?
Yeah. Contemporary, Candid, Prestige, or Riverside?
I mean, to me, the other big album record label from those, other than Prestige, is Riverside.
I don't even recognize the other two.
I've heard of Candid, but I don't really know it. And in Contemporary, I don't know that name. It may have switched names before or since, but I'm going to guess Riverside just because I know that labeled name and maybe that's what it is. So my answer for that is Riverside Records.
All right. So Riverside Records. All right. So let's see how many out of 10 Max got right. We'll go over the answers just really quickly. All right. Wow.
What'd I get?
You got 8 out of 10.
Okay. 80%. That's not terrible.
That's really good. So the first one, the Bill Evans recording with Sunday at Village Vanguard and Waltz for Debbie, was in 1961.
Okay, that was a guess, and I mean somewhat educated guess because I didn't think it was 50s, but that was just kind of lucky.
Wow. The best-selling jazz album of all time, obviously Kind of Blue. Bill Evans, Yusuf Lateef. That's so crazy.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good guess, and I guess we're right on that one.
Wow. Yeah. There's some debate as to Lateef's real name. It may have been Bill Huddleston, but he went by the name Bill Evans. That's crazy.
Okay. The more you know.
The Brute is obviously Ben Webster.
Yep.
Duke Ellington was born and raised in Washington, D.C. Oh, this is interesting. Paul Desmond, the alto player in Dave Brubeck's band for many years, had an agreement with his boss that prevented him from doing what on any of his solo albums. It was not play the song Take 5. It was have a piano player on his albums.
Really?
Yeah.
That is kind of, wow, that's surprising.
The thing that only 20% of people got that right. the thing here says it's impossible to imagine why Paul would make this agreement.
Yeah, I mean, you could use a great guitar player, and I think that's probably what he did. Maybe Jim Hall or somebody comes to mind of who he probably played with. But yeah, you would just substitute piano for guitar.
Dang. All right, and the Jazz Messengers question, obviously it's Joe Henderson. All of the other guys, Wayne Shorter, Hank Mobley, and who was the last?
And Benny
Golson. Yeah, those were obviously members of the Jazz Messengers. Oh, here it is. Okay. Which jazz movie starred a host of great jazz musicians? That one is Round Midnight. Max knew that Dexter Gordon was in that one, so that's probably a giveaway there. Ray Brown was married to Ella Fitzgerald. Good one there. And then Lester, this is the second one you got wrong. It wasn't Riverside. It was Contemporary, which was an LA-based label, which recorded musicians such as Art Pepper, Hampton Hawes, and Shelly Manne.
Okay, a lot of West Coast cats.
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't know that last one.
That's really good. 8 out of 10. That was solid. You got some right that you weren't really sure about either with the Bill Evans, both Bill Evans questions.
Yeah, I need to check out a lot more Bill Evans. But I mean, they were educated guesses, and I think I guessed well, and I enjoyed that. We should do more trivia in the future.
Yeah, we'll definitely do it. Maybe next time we can have me do a trivia. That I will not go 8 for 10. I promise you that much. But that was good. Max's jazz history is apparently on point. But speaking of history, let's get into the history for the album that we're getting into this week, The Seventh Hand. There's not really a whole lot of history to speak of. It's kind of been described as it explores relationships between the presence and nothingness across an hour-long suite comprised of 7 movements. So it's kind of meant to be thought of as movements or like a suite instead of like songs specifically, which is kind of a more classical approach to music than maybe the fundamental jazz approach, which would be songs. So yeah, let's get into some of the personnel on the album. So, Max, why don't you start us out with Immanuel Wilkins, and then we'll get into some of the other players on the album.
Yeah, Immanuel Wilkins is the alto player on this. He was born in 1998, so he's younger than either you or I, Dwayne. We got to step it up.
And he's on Blue Note.
I know. What are we doing? He's a Philly guy, grew up in Philly, first played in the church. He studied at Juilliard. Learned from the greats like Steve Wilson, Joe Temperley, and the Bruce Williams. He's also worked with Jason Moran, Gerald Clayton, Solange, Wynton Marsalis, and many others. And his recording leadership album debut as a leader on the hit was in 2020 from also Blue Note Records, entitled Omega, which I also listened to, and we may go over at some time in the future. But he's kind of very, new on the scene, and he has his own thing, and he's worked with a lot of great musicians, and he's getting around. And so I think it's good that we're doing an Immanuel Wilkins album.
Yeah, and that Omega album really put him on the map. That one was really critically revered, and so that's kind of why this release was so highly anticipated from him, with it being on Blue Note, newer Blue Note stuff, him being young, and Omega kind of getting the praise that it did. So, well, I'm going to get into Micah Thomas, who's the piano player on the album. He was born in 1997, so all these cats I think are younger than we are, so they're all in their mid-20s, really quite young. He was born in Columbus, Ohio, and he started playing the piano by the age of 2, which is insane. And he began gigging during his sophomore year of high school, which kind of reminds me of us a little bit. That's kind of, we started to get into it when we were in high school. And
absolutely.
He also went to Juilliard, so I guess that's where he met Immanuel Wilkins, probably safe to say. He's performed with J.D. Allen, John Clayton, Billy Drummond, Stacey Dillard, Joel Ross, and he tours as a leader of a trio, and but most notably, he's part of the Immanuel Wilkins Quartet.
Yep. Another up and comer who's got his own thing going on, but he can kind of do it all. And you can hear him pretty well represented on this album, and we'll talk a lot more about him as we go on.
Yeah, so let's get into the bass player, Daryl Johns. He was born in the Bronx in the late 90s, so another young cat. A musical family, drummer Steve Johns and saxophonist Debbie Keefe. He started playing at a young age and awarded an honorable mention as a semi-finalist by the Thelonious Monk Institute during the 2009 Monk Institute bass competition. We spoke about Helen Sung, who won an award from the same institute. She was on the T.S. Monk album, so definitely go check out that episode and that album. It's really good, and she's an incredible player. So a fellow Monk Institute semifinalist. So, but by the end of 2010, he was recording in the Rudy Van Gelder studio. Performed with Wallace Ronnie, Steve Wilson, Billy Hart, Christian Sands, and some others as well. And then...
Yeah. He's an interesting guy because he, very early on, at a young age, he was like 11, 12, 13, being in the recording studio with Rudy Van Gelder. And so that's just kind of amazing to think about.
Yeah.
I don't know, all these guys, really young. And then the drummer you were getting to is Kweku Sumbri, who originally comes from Washington, D.C., born in the late 90s. He's a multi-instrumentalist. All things percussion is what he does. He's known for playing the djembe, the drum set, West African percussion instruments as well. He's traveled the world and has performed with many, many different players, including Solange Knowles, Cyrus Chestnut, Reggie Workman, Ambrose, I can never pronounce his last name. Ambrose Akinmusire. Do you know how to pronounce his name?
Yeah, Akinmusire, I think.
Akinmusire. Yeah. So, and a couple of the other guys we mentioned also have performed with Ambrose as well. So,
yeah,
and
that's a cool list of people. Cyrus Chestnut, Reggie Workman.
Absolutely. And then a neat aspect to this album is there are a couple of movements or tunes that feature the flute from flutist Elena Penderhughes, who's originally from the Bay Area, San Francisco, California. And she started playing flute and also singing by the age of 7. And around the age of 11, she was already making waves in the music scene, being featured in an HBO special on young musicians. And since then, she's won many awards, played at Carnegie Hall, the White House, Monterey Jazz Festival, and has also performed with greats like Herbie Hancock, Kenny Barron, Christian Scott, and Future.
Yeah, she's really talented. She comes from a musical family. Her brother, Samora Penderhughes, is a jazz pianist, and he's really good as well. We could get into he's got some cool albums out as well, and I think their father played as well. So a musical family. She's most notable for playing with Christian Scott. She plays with him a lot, and she tours with Herbie Hancock and played on Herbie's newest album. She was on that as well. So she definitely is one of the most well-known jazz flautist currently. So cool to see her on this album with Immanuel Wilkins. But cool, let's get into the actual album itself. The first track on the album is entitled Emanation. Max, why don't you start out by telling us a little bit about this track?
I think this track is overall a great representation of the approach and the musical emphasis, the musical things that Immanuel Wilkins wants to emphasize in this album. I think this is overall just a great representation of everything he's putting into it musically. And at the beginning, it's kind of hard for me to hear what the time signature is. They're really kind of playfully messing around with the time, and the drums are doing a lot, but it's kind of cool to listen for that. Could you tell what the time signature was in that beginning section?
Not really. You can feel there's an eighth note pulse, but you can't really feel where it's divided, in my opinion. But you can feel that there is a pulse. It's hard to tell how it's divided or what comprises a measure of music.
Yeah, I tried to group it in 7 or 9, and it was almost that, but not quite.
It could be mixed as well too.
That's what I think it is. I think it's mixed meter.
Yeah, it doesn't quite feel structured enough to really for us to be able to count it. Those guys obviously know what's going on, but it's hard because there's not really a succinct melody, so it's hard to really be like, okay, this is beat one, for sure.
Right.
So
right.
It does get kind of hard to count it.
And there is kind of a melody outlined from Immanuel on the alto sax. I would say it's kind of based on large intervallic movement. It's almost jumpy at certain moments. And then right at the 1 minute mark, it sounds like he's improvising, and we're getting into real solos. I love the drums, and to me on this track, the drums shine kind of throughout and really make everything really interesting. I'm not sure if I dig everything else that's going on. At certain moments, the piano seems a little too heavy, and the saxophone sound is very, very light. And I'm not trying to dig at Immanuel Wilkins. I just think at moments his sound and his tone is just a little too light in regards to everything else that's going on.
Yeah, and I think one thing that Immanuel does is he is unique in his style and his approach, and I think he's going for something here with the spiritual aspect, and we talked about how he wants this to be an hour-long suite, not really individual tracks. So there definitely is a different approach that he's taking to this album, and I can appreciate that he's sticking to that. But I agree with Max. One thing, a problem that I kind of have with this song is it just seems really busy, and kind of a theme throughout this album that I just feel like there's a little bit of a lack of direction. Like you said, the solo starts at a minute, and it just kind of runs and runs. He has a lot of runs. There's not a whole lot of space or really different rhythmic ideas. It just kind of runs on top of runs, and he's good. He's killing, but it just feels like it's busy. And I agree with Max. There's a piano solo as well, and it's kind of a lot of sweeping runs as well. I agree with Max that I really do like what the drums and even the bassists are doing throughout the track. And there are a couple cool things that the piano player does that I do like. There's some cool modal left-hand ideas, which there's kind of a lot of hints at modalism and kind of some avant-garde freer jazz things. He does that at 407 to 422, and then there's some pretty cool chromatic movement from 435 to 440. And I think as the piano solo goes, it actually starts to develop and swing a little bit more, and it gets a little bit more interesting to me as it goes on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was just going to say the saxophone sound does get a little heavier and darker and deeper as he goes on in his solo. And you're right, it is kind of constant eighth notes, constant 16th notes. There's some obvious influences from Ornette Coleman, maybe Eric Dolphy in his solo, but it kind of drones on, and I kind of lose focus until later on in the piano solo, where we get an actual swing section. And so they actually do swing on this track, Emanation, right around the 5 minute mark, 5:20 mark. And you get some actual quarter note walking from the bass at 5:45. I really dig. And so that kind of 5 minute to 6 minute mark, I really do like.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there. I think that as the song kind of goes on, it starts to make a little bit more sense to me. The beginning seems a little bit busy to me, and there's just kind of a lot going on, and it doesn't seem really succinct, and the melody doesn't seem super clear or succinct. It's being played by Immanuel Wilkins, like Max said. But then when the sax comes back in with the melody, they kind of bring the dynamics down, and then the melody on the way out seems much more succinct to me than on the way in. It kind of makes sense, and it speaks to me a little bit more on the way out. And I enjoyed the tune the way that it ended, but it just kind of questioned the lack of clarity at the beginning of the track for me.
I think that's a good point. Yeah, the sax comes back in with that melodic idea right around 6:30 mark. And I do like the dynamic movement downward. It's very musical. And then right after that, it goes right into the next track on the album called Don't Break. And so you'll notice if you listen to it that it's meant to be listened to almost succinctly, one track right after another. Or you can listen to it separately. With a lot of them, I think there's one or two where you really can't, or it doesn't work as well. But here it goes right into the next track called Don't Break. And this, to me, there is a really nice melody laid out by Wilkins on the horn. And this kind of speaks out just a little bit more to me melodically. And then we get a percussion ensemble pretty quickly, right at the 15-second mark, and there's some call and response from the keys and the saxophone that I really dig. And then the two kind of play melodically together, and then they go back and forth. What did you think about all that?
Yeah, I really like what the band is doing and what the percussion ensemble is doing. For me, when the percussion ensemble, it doesn't necessarily like always feel like it fits, but I like individually what's going on. And so I like what the sax and the piano are doing. That call and response is really cool. But then around the 2-minute mark, they start to feature the percussion ensemble more. And I like when they do that, and it turns into just a solo percussion ensemble. And I really like that they do this feature. It just kind of feels, it's interesting how they chose to kind of overlap the two things.
I think you're right. It doesn't necessarily match together as well as maybe they intended. To me, it's the percussion ensemble and then the jazz quartet. It's not as connected musically, or doesn't fit as well right around that 2-minute mark like you alluded to. That's where you start to hear like the percussion ensemble is just taking over and everything else that's going on doesn't fit in. I don't understand. I think the percussion ensemble is included for a number of reasons. One, it alludes to, great African drumming and African culture and a lot of musical influence, from Africa that Immanuel Wilkins wants to portray in his music. And number two, I think Kwiku, the drummer on the album, plays with this particular percussion ensemble. So, Kwiku probably said, let's add these guys in. They're a group I play with. It'd be kind of fun. It would be musical to do, an ode to Africa. But it doesn't work musically as well as I think it was intended to. And that's clear to me the last, 2 minutes of it.
Yeah, it feels like there's kind of more of an emphasis on this free-spiritedness and this spirituality, like that's kind of more emphasized than necessarily like the music and the feel of the music itself. And so in my opinion, like I like what's going on with the band and with the percussion, but to me, it would have made more sense if it would have started with the band and then somehow transitioned into the percussion, not just kind of starts with the band and then just throw the percussion on top of it. And they're kind of playing, it almost sounds like two different songs at once, kind of just both playing their own thing, and then it's just percussion. It would have made more sense to me if you just kind of started with the band and then found a way to transition into that kind of West African drumming percussive thing, because I really do like both elements of the song, and I think that drum group sounds really good, and I enjoyed listening to that.
Yeah, I agree 100%. It sounds like two different songs going on at the same time, unfortunately. But there's a lot of musical elements in there, and I dig the percussion ensemble. And again, I appreciate the ode to African music influence in not only Western music, but obviously, it influences Immanuel Wilkins. So I'm glad that it's there, but I think it could have been done just a little bit better. And then the next song on the album is called Fugitive Ritual Selah, or Selah?
Selah, yeah.
Selah. And this is kind of meant to be a hymn in an ode to black spaces, as Immanuel Wilkins puts it. I think he was thinking of the black church and just a lot of, societal areas where a lot of black Americans congregate and are allowed to be themselves. And so this is kind of an ode to that. And Selah means pause or giving space for the Holy Spirit. And so he's kind of mixing in elements of the black church and really just kind of exploring things related to areas where, black Americans can really feel the Holy Spirit and be amongst themselves and go from there. So I kind of dig that. And this one I think is also the most listened to track on Spotify from the album.
Yeah, by far it's the most listened to track. This is the track on the album that I've listened to the most, and I actually have it in a few of like playlists that I have and stuff. So I really do enjoy this track. there's a really nice bass intro that happens, and then there's some nice accompaniment that happens from the keys. And then I just like this melody a lot. This melody is just, there's a good use of space. The band is playing together well during the melody. And it just feels like this track to me is so much more clear with its intentions than the prior two tracks. Like, I really understand what Immanuel Wilkins is getting at with this track.
Yes, and also the time is clearer. We're kind of in 6/8 time. It's also a nice bass feature. Overall, it's kind of a lighter touch, and there's a lot of spiritual undertones I can get the sense of with this particular track. The sax is in right around the 30-second mark. The melody's very nice, and I think Wilkins' sound here kind of combines classical saxophone sound with some elements of smooth jazz sound. So it's a very unique sound and tone he's producing on the instrument. It's not really my style. I don't really dig it. I don't think it, follows a lot of the sort of traditional saxophone sound that we're used to hearing in the usual way, but I applaud him for him doing it, and it's his unique thing. I don't know, at some moments I get classical saxophone coming to my mind when I listen to him, and I don't really understand that, but I appreciate it for it, being different, and he's doing his thing. I just don't really dig it at moments.
Yeah, I think the one thing with this track is that there's not really an actual saxophone solo, which kind of stands out to me because it feels like this is a track where you could have a really nice and saxophone solo, and it would fit the spiritual feeling of the album to have a saxophone solo and let Immanuel Wilkins kind of shine. But to me, the only thing that's kind of even a semblance of improvisation on this would be Sumbry on the drums, and he kind of gets into some different grooves and stuff, and on this one he's the one who's really standing out to me and kind of shines above the rest. I think the drumming is really what keeps this track interesting and what keeps me interested while I'm listening to the track, because it seems like they just kind of go through the melody kind of repeatedly. There's not really a change in the melodic ideas. There's no saxophone solo, which I was, speaking of. So yeah, I think Sumbry really does stand out to me. And yeah, I think this is a nice tune and it's well written, but it kind of boggles my mind that there is no sax solo. It's just like Max said, it is jazz, but it's lacking some of the foundations of jazz. So I question. It kind of feels a little bit more theatrical to me, like it's almost like a soundtrack rather than what you'd expect from a jazz recording, which I get what he's going for, but I question some of the foundational stuff that's going on with it.
I think you're hitting a lot of great different points that I would concur with. I mean, number one being, there are a lot of moments on this album that are improvised, and there's a lot of collective improvisation, especially later on in the album. And so I do question, why on this track would you have no solo at all when sometimes in the other tracks you have too much soloing, if there's such a thing. I don't want to go there, or
well,
I don't
we
wanna,
will get into Lift, so we can...
Yeah, right. We're going to go there. But I don't want to, be offensive or anything. It is kind of, you said mind-boggling. It's not necessarily mind-boggling, but it is a moment I questioned, and I do wonder why. There are some classic jazz recordings where there were not really solos or not many solos. If you hear like Ben Webster, he recorded the tune "That's All," which is a ballad, and he just kind of plays through the form 1.5 times. And he does like a little cadenza, but there's no real solo, real saxophone solo. And there's some moments of that throughout jazz history. Eddie Lockjaw Davis also did some kind of more pop-oriented records with Shirley Scott, where there's not much soloing, or they only do 2 times through the form or something. So there's those kind of moments in jazz history where there's not much soloing, but everything else is there. The soul, the way you treat melody, the swing, the different feels you can do bossa nova versus swing and so forth and so on. But and usually there's like little moments of solo, but here it's just, kind of just melody and a lot of playful rhythm section comping going on, which is interesting. And overall, it's a nice relaxed feel. But yeah, it is questionable.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's important to note is that the lack of solo, like this is still a well-written tune and a good tune. I think that's a personal preference thing for me, and for me, I question why there isn't a solo. But it's not to say that it isn't a good tune. I really enjoy listening to this tune. I just feel like I personally could get more out of this tune. I want to hear Immanuel Wilkins solo. I want to hear what he could do with this tune.
And I have one more point to make on that, which is Ben Webster could get away with not playing a real solo because his sound and his treatment of the melody was so beautiful and so touching, and he does different embellishments, and there's so much emotion in the melody that he's playing that I'm not missing something if he decides not to take a solo section. Whereas in this case, I'm not getting as much from Immanuel Wilkins' sound, or I don't dig it as much, or he's not doing enough variations on the melody or on his sound in general. So to me, that's why I'm missing a solo, is because I kind of want more from Wilkins somewhere, even on the melody, if that's all he's giving.
Yeah, I think that kind of goes back to what I was saying, that at a certain point, it's Sumbry that kind of captivates your attention and what he's doing. Not to say that Immanuel Wilkins is disinteresting, but I think at a certain point, that's what you're going to latch onto, because that's what's kind of developing, and you kind of hear the kind of playfulness in the rhythm section that's going on. And so I agree with what Max is saying there. I would like if Immanuel was featured more and the rhythm section could kind of do that playfulness behind an Immanuel Wilkins solo. I think that would be really hip.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to the next track, entitled Shadow. And in this instance, the melody starts right away on Shadow, and it's kind of a 4-bar idea. I think it's repeated 6 times or so, maybe 6, 7, 8 times, but it's quite a few times. And the sax solo, it's not there's a gotcha moment.
Yeah.
Where he's where right after he does that melody 6 or 8 times, he starts playing some lower notes on the horn, and I was kind of digging that, and then he goes right back into the head. So it was a teaser, and I was like, oh, something different with his sound, and he's pulling from low notes, and it's okay, he's going to start low and go high, but no, he goes right back into the melody. And later he does do a solo right around 228. And there's a lot to talk about in that solo. What did you think about that moment where it was a trick and he does the head again after taking, 4 bars of some low notes and moving around a little bit?
Yeah, I was definitely, in my notes, I was tricked as well. I do like the repeated ideas in the melody. I like that. I think that's hip. I enjoy that repeated melody. And yeah, I started writing notes on his solo. I was like, oh, his tone is light as he starts the solo at 122. And then I said, what I thought was his solo just turns into them playing the melody some more at 146. So yeah. It's interesting. I don't know. It's not terrible. I could take it or leave it. It doesn't really bother me, but it just kind of feels like this song. One thing I wrote is that he does take an actual solo at 228, and then it eventually kind of just goes back into them playing the melody. And it's obvious that Wilkins is very talented and has a good understanding of the language. It just, to me, it feels like there's a bit of a hesitance to write the songs in a manner that would showcase that. And so this tune seems to be more focused on the melodies themselves than it would be on, like Max and I said, showcasing like Immanuel Wilkins' abilities, which I guess that's the style that they're going for. But there is a bit of a saxophone solo on this. I don't know. It feels like there's a bit of a hesitance for Immanuel Wilkins to showcase his saxophone playing.
I think that's a good point. I will say this little solo is kind of dynamic to me. There's some nice interplay between the keys and the saxophone, and he gets a little busier right around 302, starts doing some actual solo techniques. And then back at 312 or so, he kind of plays the head lick idea, and then the piano solo kind of starts. So there's a little, there's little short solos in here, but you're right. Overall, he's emphasizing the melody and textures and sounds and the presence of hopefully some sort of spirituality in everything that they're doing. And then later on, the bass comes out to me a little bit more right around that 340 mark.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the rhythm section, there's definitely some interesting things, especially with the bass player and Sumbry on the drums. There's definitely a lot of stuff that keeps this interesting. I think Sumbry kind of is what he keeps my attention for most of the album. So there definitely is some cool rhythm section stuff going on throughout the album.
And then I think I heard one or two almost blues licks or blues ideas from Immanuel Wilkins a little later on around 352. They're very short, but it sounds almost like blues a little bit from what he's playing. And I just felt like a sense of relief, like finally something reminiscent of of a blues idea. And so I really like that moment. And then they kind of repeat the head to finish out onto a final chord, and there's no added licks on top from the sax player, which kind of made me, I wanted some little added licks there, but it's kind of cool how they end. And overall, it's a nice feel. It's nice and light. At some moments, I do think, again, Wilkins' sound is just a little too light, almost wispy at times, and I don't understand that.
Yeah, I definitely can understand what you're saying there. It feels like there's just a slight, I mean, that is his style and that's his sound, but it just feels like there's kind of a slight hesitance to let go and just kind of, like let themselves shine and let loose a little bit. But they're sticking to the feel of the album, this kind of spiritual ideas that's going on. So let's get into the fifth track on the album, which is entitled Witness. There's a very short piano intro on this one. And then this is the first time we get Elena Pinderhughes. And so the melody is like I said, it's like has this theatrical feel to it. Almost sounds like something that you'd hear in a soundtrack. And there's this, it's in 3/4, and it's all dotted half note movement. So it's all taking up the entire measure with the rhythm section. And then you get Elena Pinderhughes playing over that. And I think what Elena Pinderhughes is playing is some of the most interesting soloing, probably the most interesting soloing we've had thus far on the album. So there's some really cool ideas from her.
Absolutely. Yeah, to me on this track, Elena Pinderhughes pretty much is the thing to listen to. Overall, I kind of like the nice piano start, but to me, this is another moment that screams classical music to me. And I'm not saying that's not necessarily, that's not a bad thing or something to shy away from. It is a little unexpected, and I don't know. It's just one of those moments that I question: where in the world of jazz are we? I don't know. This particular track entitled "Witness," just I don't. There's some improvisation. The flute really shines later on, has some nice soloing. So obviously that's jazz oriented, and the overall treatment of the instrumentation and the way the instruments are interacting with each other, that's jazz. I just get a lot of sort of classical influence on this track. I
completely agree with you, Max. One thing I said is I like this track and I like the music, but it feels like it belongs more so on a soundtrack than a jazz album to me. It sounds something that would be performed in more of like a classical setting or on a movie or in a, like it's setting the scene for something. It just doesn't quite feel like it is fully jazz. And I'm not saying that it's not jazz, because like Max said, it has so many jazz elements and the players are all incredible players and they're jazz players. It just, the composition feel a little bit different than what you'd expect. And I respect Immanuel Wilkins for wanting to tap into that. But to me, I don't feel like my attention has fully been captured as I'm listening to what I want to, like on a jazz recording, a Blue Note recording. I just don't feel like my attention's been fully captured in that way.
Right. I will say there are two things I really like about this track. Number one, we do get some nice flute playing and some nice flute vibrato towards the end. So there's some vibrato I dig. That's kind of my thing. And I do like how the saxophone is just sticking to dotted half notes and the flute's on top. And then the next track on the album, they switch it to where the flute's kind of playing a melody and the saxophone's improvising on top. So I like that kind of juxtaposition of the two horns on the track. And overall, I think it's kind of cool. Just overall, the feeling I'm getting from the song, a lot of things came to my mind. It seemed somewhat ominous, and it's kind of always moving, but it's moving very slowly. And there's not as much development as I would desire, but it seems like I get the sense like I'm in a moment where I'm getting both Halloween and Easter at the same exact time.
That's a cool way to describe it, and I do agree with that. And that's kind of why it gives me like a soundtrack vibe, is because it's like the sound, like it sounds good, and like it does like kind of give you those feelings. And I think that is what you said. One thing there is one thing I want to touch on is that just feels like there's a bit of a lack of development. Like if this song had more development to it, I think I would enjoy it a little more. But it feels like it kind of, with the dotted quarter notes, the rhythm section of the saxophone, they stay on that the entire time. There's a change in timbre towards the end, and it does change a little bit dynamically towards the end, but it just doesn't feel like it's really going anywhere. So while I think it's a nice song and it sounds nice, the melody's nice, the flute playing is really nice, I question like, where is this going?
It reminds me of Purgatory. You don't know where you're going, and you're just kind of stuck. And I hate to say it like that, but
maybe that's what they're going for, because there is a
true.
Spiritual, like maybe that's the point. And so if that is the point, that's well done, because we're questioning where are we going. And if it's not,
Right.
so I do that's how I feel about it, but it could be intentional. And there are times we listen to Nduzu Makatini, and there were things that I questioned there, but after listening, it kind of things started to make more sense. So there are times where we might not personally like something, but it might be what the artist is going for, and that's why we feel that way.
Absolutely.
It just might not be a decision that we would make if we were, writing the tune.
Right. And this track is kind of related, like I mentioned earlier, to the next track called Lighthouse. And here, they're treating the two instruments the opposite, the two horns the opposite way on this one, where the flute is kind of more basic or doing a melody, and the saxophone is kind of riffing and layering improvisations on top of the flute. So I like that. And also with Lighthouse, I like this intro a lot, where the solo piano starts and then you layer in the rhythm section and then the horns come in last. So it's a little more of a dynamic intro than the previous track, Witness.
Yeah, I think, this definitely, there is some more development here, and there is some more, like Max said, the layering is cool. And this time, like Max said, there's a flute melody, and you get the saxophone improvising over it. And then the melody at about the 56-second mark, it kind of turns into a free jazz solo section. And so the piano drops out at like 120, and this is very Ornette Coleman-esque to me. So I definitely get what they're going for, and the influences here, which is that kind of free jazz feel.
Yeah, and as it goes on, the sax gets a little heavier, and there's kind of more chutzpah behind everything he's doing. Then it kind of just suddenly drops in intensity around the 250 mark, the end of the 2 minute into the 3 minute mark. I don't know. I wanted kind of a longer dramatic decrescendo. Did you notice that? What were you thinking?
Yeah, I would just want to point out that I'm not like a huge free jazz person, but I do appreciate it for what it is. And I think that this section of this album and this solo is actually really well done for what they're trying to accomplish. So I really actually do like Wilkins sax playing and what he's showcasing here. We're actually getting some of his personality here and starting to hear him shine, which is kind of what I've been wanting. I'll appreciate your approach to the music, but as a jazz musician, I want to hear what you have to offer when you're playing on a jazz album. So I do appreciate that he's showcasing his playing more so on this track, but it's like the second to last track on the entire album. I've been kind of waiting for him to do this, but yeah, I do get what you're saying with the kind of quick decrease in dynamics there.
Yeah, and you're right. That free jazz section is more interesting to listen to. I really dig, you mentioned it, when the piano cuts out and it's just sax interplaying with the drums and a little bit of the bass. And that's, to me, that's reminiscent of like Kenny Garrett on alto with, I think, Jeff Tain Watts on drums. You know, they're going at it back and forth. So that's kind of a moment where I'm like, okay.
And that's really musical.
Yeah.
And that's very jazz influenced. It's not, it's more free jazz influenced or avant-garde, but that's really nice and really musical there. So I really want to give props to that section. I enjoyed that a lot.
Yeah, and then right after, the flute enters with kind of longer held out notes, what we call goose eggs, because on the sheet music, it's just a whole note. It kind of looks like a goose egg. So that's kind of cool. It's a different texture that that really kind of opens up what's going on and changes the feel a little bit. And by the 3-minute mark, it's much lighter, and it just seems a little too different to me than what came before it. It's just like all of a sudden we're in a different place, musically speaking. And then there's a nice melody established. The drums get a little busier, and they move kind of into a solo on top of the melody. Again, that's played by the sax and keys.
Yeah, I really enjoy this section. They do get into a more melodic kind of feel, but I really do enjoy the drum feature on this. And it's kind of busy, but it's very grooving and it's very in the pocket, so this track is definitely catching my interest more than, and there's a lot more. You'll notice we have a lot more to say about this track because musically there's a lot more piquing our interest than, maybe some of the tracks previous.
Absolutely. The drums do shine here. Again, Kweku is killing it. There's lots of snare drum I'm hearing right around 418. It's very driving, kind of busy. There's some nice, really rhythmic hits around the 440 mark by Kweku. At certain moments, it seems chaotic, but it's always grooving, like you were saying. So it's always something that makes me feel interested, and I'm in the music, listening to what Kweku is doing almost throughout the whole solo. I'm really enamored, and it's more musically interesting and dynamic here. And it also sounds like the piano and the drums are soloing at the same time at certain moments. So there's another moment of collective improv that is kind of, is definitely jazz oriented. And so I like that. And then there's lots of cymbals and percussion playing after the 6-minute mark too. So we get kind of more percussive elements as we go on in the track.
Yeah, I definitely, like you're saying, there's that kind of open solo section with the piano, drums, and the sax, and there's some really nice interplay there, and there's some cool references back to the melody, which I like as well. So that part definitely does feel very musical and very jazz, jazz oriented, which is nice. And yeah, the melody kind of ends at the 6-minute mark, and it turns into a cadenza with the piano and the percussion. And I like this ending a lot. It seems like it just it feels very enlightened and spiritual to me, and it feels like it fits the theme of the album well.
Yeah, and I also like what the flute is doing. It's kind of floating on top freely over top with longer notes from the sax as well. So the horns are really adding a lot here to the ending to change the direction of the song that's going to lead into the last track on the album called Lift. And there's also a lot of cool piano sweeps as well that move dynamically with a lot of trills at different parts of the piano. Did you like what the piano was doing there?
Yeah, for sure. I pretty much this entire ending. It feels like it feels very enlightened to me. It feels very uplifting, and it just makes sense in the album. And so I enjoyed that entire track, and definitely the ending of it. It makes a lot of sense to me.
Now it kind of transitions to something where we have a lot of different thoughts about.
This is
Compared to that.
this is the last track on the album. It's entitled Lift, and just so you know, it's 26 minutes long, so it's half of the entire album. And
Yeah.
I want to just let, like, we don't both need to talk about all 26 minutes, so I'll let you talk about, most of it, and I'll kind of interject as I want to. But there is a lot to talk about with this, and this is the one where we might kind of let loose on what we feel about this. So Max, why don't you start us out?
Well, again, there's a lot to say. It is 26 minutes long. You have to get strapped in if you want to listen all the way through this last track. Don't
make lunch plans. Don't make reservations.
Cut out your afternoon if you want to listen to this track and really listen in for what's going on musically. Because I don't know. I think you can get a lot of what's going on from the first 2 minutes, and then it's a lot of the same thing, which we'll get into. But, to really just go over how the track, reveals itself, it starts with the same feel as the ending of the previous track, Lighthouse, and then it almost immediately gets very dark, and there's some screeching sounds and some wails from the saxophone. So it's just taking an immediate turn, 180-degree turn towards a different feel and timbre overall.
Yeah, it starts out, it almost sounds like something from a horror film, and it's like not super tonally centered, and to me it feels like it has a connection to a darker spiritual side. So that's what I'm getting on this one. But yeah, it almost sounds like you could put it in the background of a horror film and it would fit right in.
Yeah, that's a good point. The piano and the saxophone are kind of going off while the drums seem to almost have a steady beat a little bit. And then Kwiku eventually just lays out and he comes back in later. And I question that moment because I was kind of digging what he was playing, where he comes in with a steady beat, almost a steady beat, and then he just kind of stops. And I don't understand. Why didn't we do something with that? It seems like we're all kind of just collectively improvising at that moment. I don't know. I didn't understand that. Did you hear that moment?
Yeah, I did hear that. And there are just some things in this that confuse me. The first few minutes of this song seems to be just the same kind of thing for like 2.5 minutes until there's kind of a dynamic build upward, but it's still kind of the same feeling. There's some cool like piano upward movement with like both hands. But yeah, it feels pretty much like the same kind of thing for the first few minutes of the song.
Yeah, it's a lot of just free jazz, collective improv going on. I do kind of appreciate some of the things Immanuel Wilkins is doing. He has some nice false fingering trills right around the 230 mark, very short staccato phrases. And then he uses a lot of just endless 16th note ideas just up and down the horn. Definitely free jazz to me. There's some almost animalistic extended saxophone sounds at the 325 mark. And I've heard kind of more straight ahead players like James Carter use similar sounds. But to me, when James Carter does it, it's still very swinging. And here it just seems just more free and an emphasis on the sound and the spirituality and where you want to go with that sound rather than how well does that sound build the swing or fit into the pocket.
Yeah, and so at 408, right after this that Max is talking about, it's kind of the first semblance of any kind of groove or rhythm from the rhythm section, and it's mostly, or any semblance of time really, it's mostly highlighted by kind of up and down bouncing bass lines. So that's kind of the first time that we start to get any kind of groove feeling or rhythm feeling in the song. And then it's hard to really write. Like I put thought 6 minutes in has been the same free jazz collective improv feel this entire time, but hasn't moved much or done dynamically in my opinion. So that was 6 minutes in. I thought I'd just give a little 6 minute in thought. That's where I was feeling 6 minutes in, as that I'd listened to 6 minutes of basically the same thing.
Yeah, I will say it is kind of interesting. Around the 5 minute mark, the saxophone drops out and it's just piano binging with the drums going on, playing freely, yet mostly kind of intentionally. But you're right. The first 6 minutes are all kind of the same thing going on. And it's more of that later on, too. When the sax comes back in after that 6 minute mark, he uses kind of extended screeching sounds. And then he gets a little lighter and the sax comes in with kind of held out growling, flutter tonguing low notes. Those were kind of interesting to me. Did that come out to you?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. At the 7 minute mark, so a minute after my 6 minute recap, there is a change of feel, which is good. I've been waiting for something to change in the song, so there is a change in feel, and there's these low droning notes by the sax and the piano's improvising over top, and they almost sound like kind of like pedal tone techniques. Max, can you describe like what's going on? Because I mean, I understand like pedal tones on a brass instrument or something like that, but there's like this low, it almost feels like he's getting multiple like almost undertones, if you know, like out of the saxophone. What is he doing there?
Well, there's a couple of things he could be doing. I don't know exactly what he's doing, but some things come to my mind. Number one, he could just be flutter tonguing or growling. So flutter tonguing is when you're, in the Spanish language, you have the rolling R. I can't really do it, but you do that while blowing into the mouthpiece and making the sound on the saxophone, and that creates a kind of a similar effect. And then the other version is growling, where you're literally going, ugh, and you're grunting at the same time you're blowing air through the mouthpiece of the saxophone. And you kind of create that growling kind of 50s rock and roll tenor sax sound. Although jazz greats like Illinois Jacquet and Ben Webster were awesome at it too. And there's a history of it being used by jazz saxophone players, both growling and flutter tonguing. But that's something that will come out more in the extreme registers of the horn. So because he's really low and he's playing low notes on the alto, and if you growl on those lower notes, you can get that kind of almost pedal tone sound.
Yeah.
So to me, that's probably what he's doing. Another thing that comes to my mind is playing overtones. And kind of mixing in fingerings of different notes on top of the low note fingerings that you're doing, which can affect the tone of the instrument and the sound of the note you're making on the saxophone. And so it's either, one of those three things or a combination of a couple of those things. And there's just a lot of extended kind of sounds you can make with different stuff you may do with your embouchure in addition to those things. When you're around the mouthpiece, when your lips are around the mouthpiece, and the way you use your tongue or just a lot of different things you could be using. It's probably something with the fingers, probably something with flutter tonguing or growling, or something with overtones.
Yeah, or a mix of, I definitely, that's what I was getting at is, I kind of felt like there was some use of overtones because it almost felt like he was getting multiple tones out at the same time, which you can get from playing certain instruments. There are different techniques to where you can play one note and get another note to come through on the instrument at the same time. So that's kind of what I was getting, was it felt like he was playing one note, but you could hear the overtones below, what he was playing. So kind of like a almost pedal tone beneath it, which was super interesting. I was definitely my interest for maybe the first time in 7 minutes was like actually really peaked, and I was really intrigued by what Immanuel Wilkins was doing there.
Yeah, and he kind of goes in that vein for a while longer, although I wish he did more with those kind of lower overtones. That is a really interesting moment. And then everything starts to shift slightly at the 9 minute mark. The drums enter in with kind of more frequent, busier playing, and the piano uses higher notes in his range, which brings a different dynamic to everything that's going on. And later on, the 10 to 11 minute mark, the saxophone gets busier, becomes more in the forefront of everything. There's some single moving lines, lots of chromatic movement at large intervals. Some moments in there, what Immanuel was playing kind of reminded me of a wasp moving around you. And just the different fast movements that insects make. I don't know, something something reminiscent of that came out to me there. I don't know.
Yeah, I listened for that, and I definitely heard what you're talking about. And I think, yeah, when you're doing this kind of avant-garde collective improv, guys will kind of pick at different ideas or sounds, and they might be playing something that sounds like a circus or something, so guys are just, so I definitely see what you're saying there in that interpretation. At this point, I'm at my 13-minute mark recap, and I just put
what's the update?
I don't feel like I really need to talk a lot more about what is happening, as though I don't feel like it's changed a whole lot. It's this avant-garde collective improv that seems pretty similar in minute 13 as it was in minute 2.
Keep in mind, we're only halfway through the whole track.
Yeah. So that's my halfway. That's my midpoint, like intermission. Those are my thoughts. Was in minute 13, I don't feel like I have a whole lot to add from what I had in minute 2. I do appreciate Max noting the different things that the players are doing. But it does seem like they're just kind of trading back and forth. Someone's playing over top. The next person's playing over top. So to me, minute 13, minute 2, not a whole lot has changed. We're kind of still doing the same thing.
I think you're right. And that keeps going for another about, 5 minutes or so. And the saxophone comes in and out a bunch. And during those out moments, other instruments are featured a little bit more, like the piano. Did you notice that? What were you thinking?
There is actually one part that caught my attention. It seems like after I do these little recaps, they kind of bring me back in a little bit. So after that 6-minute recap, at 7 minutes, there was some interesting stuff. At 14 minutes and 15 seconds in the song, don't know how often I'll say that. There was something that caught my attention. Oh, and one thing I did want to say is there is some variation from the techniques in each player. Like, it's not just exactly the same thing for 13 minutes. So that was part of my 13-minute recap. They do all kind of vary what they're doing and the techniques that they're playing in, but overall the feeling in 13-2 doesn't change a lot. But at 14-15, there's the sax. Immanuel Wilkins kind of plays an idea, and they all catch on to it, and they kind of run with it for 30 seconds. And I'm just like, this moment just stuck out to me, because after 14 minutes of listening to this, there was like actually something that felt like it meant something to me. And so it was just in such contrast to like this continuing free soloing commotion of the 14 minutes prior. So it was like, it stuck out like a sore thumb. I was like, oh my gosh, like they're playing something that like feels communicated, and
Unfortunately, that was 14 minutes too late.
Yeah.
I agree. That moment, well, not 14 minutes, but it was probably 7 to 9 minutes too late. Because that could have happened much sooner. And you're right, that was a very interesting moment, because they play back and forth off of that idea for, you're right, the next half minute or so.
And it's just, I don't hate what they're doing on the song. It's just, it feels like there's so much like it just goes on for 26 minutes, and it feels like you shouldn't have to wait 7 minutes to get something else that you're interested by. It feels like that's just, there's a lot of stuff in there, and it's hard to keep people's attention for that long. And if I weren't listening to this because I was listening to the whole album front and back, I don't know if I would get through this track, honestly, if it weren't for, wanting to listen to this and analyze it. But let's keep moving on, Max. What's
Yeah, I was going to say something different happens around the 1850 mark, where everyone kind of gets softer, and then the bass comes out, and this is, I think, really the first bass feature.
I do have a few things I want to add.
Okay.
That little thing I did say, it doesn't last long, and they are into the same thing as before. And in my opinion, I'm really starting to they're losing my attention. It's like hard. I'm trying to focus on paying attention at this point. But there is a little bit of a piano solo feature-esque section at 15:30 to 16:24, which has some semi-interesting chordal movement and some slightly more meaningful things going on. But that's all that caught my attention from minute 14 to minute 19, which Max is about to talk about.
Well, I was just going to say, yeah, you're right. That is a little interesting. And then right at the 16:30 mark, I'm thinking, is anything different going to happen? That was a moment for me, whereas you alluded to earlier, you had those moments right around 16 minutes. I was kind of feeling that. I was like, okay, what's going to happen? Anything? Are we going to go into a song section or something? But no, they really don't. They just kind of keep going on. And then right around that 19-minute mark, everything gets softer. And then the bass gets featured, which was a moment that stuck out to me. The drums also are reduced in what Kwiku is playing. He's just kind of plays around on the snare drum, which is nice. And there's some very light piano touches that the piano player is making. And there's some cool interaction between all the instruments right around the 20-minute mark. So if you're going to hone in and stick in and hammer it out and listen to the whole track, it kind of changes a little bit right around the 20-minute mark. And there's kind of some different things going on there.
Yeah, and that bass feature is nice, and it's just at this point, 19 minutes into the song, it just feels so nice to have some contrast and dynamics like change in the song, because like Max said, at 16 minutes, it's starting to feel like what's gonna, is anything gonna change, or is it just gonna be the same thing over and over? And then one thing that I noticed is there's seemingly like a piano melody at 20 minutes and 40 seconds. And then it's just met by like random insertions by other members in the band, which in my opinion don't really fit the key or the melody presented. And it just kind of dissolves back into this ominous free soloing section.
I was thinking the same thing. At 20 minutes and 40 seconds, it seems like an actual song is going to be established with the piano idea. But of course, this is not where it's going. Instead, we later get heavy banging and siren sounds from the saxophone. Oh, great. Another moment where we're going back to free jazz and anything happens. And, I don't understand this moment at all, because we're kind of forgetting or just purposefully omitting what the piano player was adding to everything that was going on, and maybe follow the piano player in that moment. I don't know. Immanuel Wilkins could cop that at least rhythmically. It's hard to hear that in the moment with the specific notes, but you could do something where you play around with that and you create a melody. Why is there this obsession where we're going to have these long, drawn out free jazz moments, and we're purposefully, intentionally trying to get away from any melody that naturally arises? I thought we want to have these moments where we can have these melodies come to us and we can explore them and improvise them together. That seemed like a key moment where that could have occurred, and instead they go back to the heavy banging and the intense sounds. And in this case, Immanuel does a lot of siren sounds, which is unrelated. I'm sorry. It's completely unrelated to what the piano player is doing at the 2040 mark, and I don't understand.
Yeah, I agree with Max. I just feel like any point where they start to develop something that I feel like is interesting, it feels like there's this need to get back to the like complete free jazz. Everyone's playing different things at different times. There's like this, every time that it feels like something is starting to develop, they cut it off, and it's just back. We've got to get back to this kind of ominous free jazz, free soloing, like collective improv thing. So I agree with Max, what Max is saying there. And kind of throughout the rest of the track, it just kind of slows down and lengthens out in like the last minute and a half. And the end is just a held note by the sax. It's random piano insertions and then just kind of random bass plucking. And at the end, it just ends with the bass plucking. And I was almost at this point mad. I said, yes. My note is, that's really how you're going to end it. And then in all caps, after 26 minutes, I listened to this, and you can't even end it it just ends in the most random way possible. Just random bass plucking.
I really don't understand this ending either.
I was almost mad. My final thoughts, I've done my recaps, my 6-minute recap, my 13-minute recap. There was no recap in between 13 minutes and the end. I just kind of stuck it out to the end. My final thoughts after 26 minutes and 22 seconds. This is what I wrote after listening to this entire song. This is how I felt. Those are 26 minutes and 22 seconds I am not getting back. And I hate to be that harsh and critical, but I would not ever listen to this song all the way through again. I don't know what the point of listening to it again would be. I don't think I could get anything else from it.
Here's what I'll say. There are specific shorter moments in Lift, the 26-minute song that we're talking about, where there is great collective improvisation, free jazz improvisation.
Yep.
And then there are other much, much, much longer moments where it's just not done as well as I've heard it done from other players in the history of this music.
And it's so repetitive. There's so much that just feels like filler. It feels like if this song were 6 minutes and all of the interesting things that happen in those 6 minutes, and there was some of that filled in between, I wouldn't have felt this way. But the fact that this song lasted 26 minutes and really did nothing the whole time, but kind of randomly inserted semi-interesting ideas, it felt like a waste of time.
I want to say a couple of other things that may seem insensitive or harsh, but I'm not meaning to. I just want to be honest. And one of those things is I like a lot of the different things Immanuel Wilkins is doing on the saxophone, but some of what he's doing is getting in the way of everything else. And if we are going to collectively improvise, we should collectively improvise, which means we should be listening to the other players we are improvising with. And just like that 2040 mark where the piano is doing something melodic, you should be going melodic as well. And you don't have to do it for very long. You can do it for a short time, but we really should be doing what we're intending to do. And I just think there's a lot of this track that doesn't happen. There's a lot of nice stuff from the rhythm section. I love what the drums are doing at the 25-20 mark where he's playing around with the rim clicks. But that was another moment where I said, why did you stop? Why? I thought the whole point is to be in the moment and develop what occurs and see where it goes and connect it to another idea that may happen from the previous idea. I don't understand.
And I think it just kind of goes back to what I said earlier, but this is just a very dramatic instance of it because it's 26 minutes is there's just this hesitation to develop things and to do that. And I just question that hesitation. I want to hear you be musical. I don't want to hear you present something that I'm interested in just to be like, no, we can't do that. We have to get back to this melody or this collective improv thing. So that's my biggest problem with this album. I like so much of what's going on, but it just feels like there's so much hesitation to let those things happen. And I don't understand that.
I read part of the blurb about this album on the Blue Note website, and I think I've read a couple of interviews with Immanuel Wilkins about what his music is all about and what he does on this album. And with in his mind, in the suite, the seventh movement called Lift is supposed to be where they're letting room. They're supposed to be letting musical room for the Holy Spirit to be, influencing everything they're doing musically, and to be in the room with them, and to move with the Spirit and see where the Spirit takes you. And it's kind of a spiritual approach, and I appreciate that, and I really dig that intention. But I don't think that's really what this track offers to me, and I think they really missed the mark on Lift, and for that reason, it kind of ruins a lot of everything else that goes into the album. I mean, you end with this in this way, with this lack of development or lack of real, interest and the different approaches you're wanting to take. I'm lost with this track, and it kind of brings everything else down with it.
Yeah, I had the exact same feeling. This track made me forget about so many things that were good about this album. This track kind of made me forget about a lot of those things, and some of the really interesting things that happen in Emanation and Fugitive Ritual Selah. I actually was like, oh yeah, those things actually happened. Like there were really good things. And so this track, we'll talk about it in our overall feelings, but this track just kind of left a sour taste in my mouth after, like being kind of on the fence and kind of understanding what he was going for. This track just kind of really left a sour taste in my mouth. But let's go ahead and get into our kind of our top threes, our not so hot tracks. I think our not so hot tracks probably very evident by now. But I'll go ahead and go first. My top three, my number one is Fugitive Ritual Selah. I think it's a beautiful song. I did have the thing, the sax solo, I wish it would have been there, but I think it's very musically well written. It's very interesting. It's dynamically nice. The drums are really, really nice. Sumbria is really, really good on this and really shines. So I enjoy that one. My number two track is Emanation. I really enjoy what's going on with Emanation as well. It's just, I don't know, it's interesting. There is some lack of development, it feels like, but it's interesting. And I think by the end, it really settles into something nice. So I really do like Emanation and the way it kind of settles in and it kind of swings and it has a nice feeling to it. So I enjoy that track. And then my third and final top three is the tune entitled Lighthouse, which features Elena Pinderhughes. And I just think it's nice. It does have that free jazz element, but I think that it's done really well in that situation. So I really do like the track Lighthouse, and I think it does a really good job, representing the spiritual things and the free jazz, but in a very tasteful way. And then I don't feel like I need to say much about it, but Lift is my not so hot track for all the reasons we've kind of mentioned already.
Yeah, I would concur with that. My number one was Emanation, which was the first track on the album. To me, that just is the best single representation of everything that is intended with this album. So I just really dig what's going on with Emanation, and you do get that swing feel for that minute and a half or so, maybe even longer. So I dig the swing. I dig the interactions that are going on and just all the different things that they're doing with the feel and with the time signatures. It's really cool. And I understand why it is the first track on the album because of those things and that, and it's the first and it's sweet. So I think it's a great way to start with what, his goals are with the album. The Fugitive Ritual Selah is my number two. I think it is very easy listening. I think that's probably the most accessible track to an audience, to a listener that's really not jazz heavy in their their musical preferences. But there's some cool things going on with Fugitive Ritual Selah. And then number three is Lighthouse, which to me really came out to me because of everything that the drummer is doing, Kwiku. I just really dig Lighthouse. And then my not so hot is also Lift, which was the last track on the album, which, we went into depth about the issues with that 26-minute long song, if you could call it that. So I just, we've gone over it. It just kind of really, there's some great moments, but overall it's just, I'm missing some things from it, even though it gives me so many notes for 26 minutes. Anyway, so that's my not so hot, which, you and I have agreed on that. So we're going to move on and we're going to go into our overall thoughts on the album. And I'll go ahead and go first. I think this second Blue Note release from Immanuel Wilkins is certainly an undertaking which deserves some appreciation. The collection of songs is meant to be seen as a big picture 7-part musical journey that attempts to portray a sense of moving spirituality that is obviously present amongst the players. Some musical moments tend to drag on without much development, and there are questionable arrangements at times throughout. We've touched on those moments. Drummer Kwiku shines on Lighthouse and Emanation, while the flute playing of Elena Pinderhughes on Witness is another shining, very satisfying feature. So there are those moments in this album I really dig. Wilkins delivers what he seemingly intends to deliver, yet it is not always on the money for me. His tone can occasionally be too light and wispy, while at other moments he is kind of screeching and distracting from other parts musically in certain collective improv sections. And we've definitely gone into that. Wilkins's approach is unique and certainly has a number of varying influences, likely including Ornette Coleman, maybe some Kenny Garrett, and definitely some Wayne Shorter as well. There's some neat compositional ideas that are well executed on the album, yet other parts of certain moments of the arrangements don't come across so well. And the 26-minute lift leaves me with much more to be desired and kind of brings everything else down with it. My overall rating is 5.4. I do have some more things to say about that. I will say, critically, a lot of critics seem to adore these types of recordings due to their differing nature. However, some of this music just leaves me unfulfilled. I do appreciate the odes to African music and religious tradition and the intention outlined from Wilkins's effort, yet I take umbrage with the notion that in order to perform music that emphasizes spirituality, you have to play quote unquote freely and in the way some of the music on the seventh hand is performed. I don't understand this idea where if you do just a regular song with an actual form, that somehow that means there's no Holy Spirit involved, there's no God present. Why isn't God present when we're playing a funk song? What about a great ballad ending cadenza? You're telling me there's no spirit in a Sonny Stick cadenza? That's crazy. Or Gene Ammons when he's playing a ballad and the way he ends his phrases, there is obviously a sense of spirit in that, in my opinion. What about open solo sections that are inserted into the middle of tunes? Like we talked about with Satchmo at Pasadena, the great Barney Biggard going off on the clarinet and his interaction with Cozy Cole. Yes, it's kind of straight ahead jazz, but those moments are spiritual. Why isn't there a sense of spirituality present in those musical moments? And I would say that there are. This treatment of musical exploration in order to reach a higher power or the spirit realm seems overdone and slightly cliche to me. I will likely not be going back to this album anytime soon. And sorry, I misspoke earlier. My overall score is a 5 out of 10.
Yeah, and I think you make some really good points there. And one thing I do agree with is there's in modern jazz, there's kind of this thing, and it's critically gets a lot of claim and revere, is like this needing for this spiritual connection and making the music as spiritual as possible. And I think sometimes it does detract from the musicality of the music. And I think there's more of an emphasis, and we talked about this, on the spiritual aspect rather than the musical aspect. And I liked what Max said. There can be spirituality in any kind of music, and especially in jazz music, you can get it from the most swing-oriented tune. There can be spirituality in that, and in blues music, there's spirituality in that. It doesn't have to be presented in a way that's just, so like it feels almost a little bit like, I don't know, they're like, you have to do this to be spiritual, like the way that Immanuel Wilkins is playing, or some of the Nduduzo Makatini stuff. Like you have to do that kind of thing to kind of get that spiritual feeling across to people, which I don't necessarily think is true.
And there's an element, and I'm not trying to be insensitive, there's an element of self-aggrandizement in that notion, because you're saying, oh, what I do is connected to a higher power. And if you're playing There Is No Greater Love, you're not connected to a higher power, and there's no sense of God in what you're doing. I just take umbrage with that. I think that is insensitive. I think that is musically ignorant. I think that is spiritually ignorant. I thought God is with us, or should be with us, all the time, and we're always present with God in those moments, no matter what we're doing, no matter what we're playing. And you can go off in a spiritual sense on a cadenza, on a solo section. You're telling me Sonny Rollins' version of Without a Song on the record The Bridge from the early 1960s, in that track where they have a rubato section, and there's a great kind of free Sonny Rollins improvisatory section that's kind of unexpected in that tune without a song. You're telling me there's no spirit in that? There's no Holy Spirit, there's no God? I disagree wholeheartedly, and I think it's disrespectful to the music to say that you have to play this way to be spiritual.
Yeah, and I definitely can understand what you're saying there, and I do like some of the things. Like one thing, the tune, the late great Pharoah Sanders, the creator has a master plan. That's very spiritual, but it's also very musical. And so I think there's just this push, and especially in modern jazz, towards this like just all-out spiritual kind of connection. And I see what you're saying there, Max. And I think there can be a way to be both, and there's spirituality in all kinds of different playing in jazz. So I get what you're saying there. I'm going to go ahead and do my overall thoughts and then my rating, and then we can kind of wrap it up. So this is Immanuel Wilkins' second Blue Notes feature, and it's one that comes with critical acclaim and a sense of spirituality. There are some interesting and well-done aspects of the album, and a few players do shine throughout. But this album misses the high mark set forth by some critics, in my opinion. The compositions on the album are sometimes interesting, such as Fugitive Ritual Selah, yet this track does lack any true solo sections, but at times the album suffers from a lack of direction or musical development. I think there is a higher emphasis being placed on spirituality and the free-spirited nature of the recording than the musicality of the tunes themselves. There seems to be an innate desire in modern jazz landscape, especially amongst critics of the music who seem to be drawn to things that are quote-unquote different or spiritual. Giovanni Russinello, a critic from the New York Times, said that the album was blues-based and gospel-infused, which I have extremely strong disagreements with. I would say that this music draws much more from classical elements and free jazz, avant-garde influences, and I don't get really any blues basis, or really, there is, I guess, some gospel influence, but not what you'd think of traditional, like modern gospel music, maybe some more hymnal stuff. It leads me to question if this critic has any idea what he's talking about. I question, I didn't even read the rest of the article when I got to the second paragraph, and he said blues-based and gospel-infused. That's just not true. I mean, it definitely has elements of jazz, of free jazz, avant-garde jazz. So, but with this being said, I do think there are some really nice elements on this album that are worth pointing out. The players do have unique styles, which I appreciate, and Kweku Sumbri and Elena Penderhugh's playing really stands out to me. Kweku seems to find a way to make tracks that don't have a lot of development or direction more interesting, and his feel, his style, his approach is great. I applaud him for that. He seems to make things that can kind of lack direction at times be a little bit more interesting and give me something to listen for. Immanuel Wilkins is obviously super talented and proficient as a player. The musical directive on this album just doesn't seem to do it for me, although I will continue to check out his music because I feel like there's enough there to interest me as to what he's capable of. And I think that he is capable of, I would be really interested to see him put out something more straight ahead and kind of get an idea of what he'd do with that. My last overall thought, the 26-minute track Lift is almost worth skipping altogether. In my opinion, I think the album would have been perfectly fine without it, and this track leaves a sour taste in my mouth, and it kind of overshadows the rest of the album. For that reason, I gave the album an overall score of a 5.7 out of 10. So Max's score 5 out of 10 and my 5.7. Our overall score is a 5.4 out of 10. In my honest opinion, I think if the song Lift weren't on the album at all, it would have maybe got over 6 for us. But that song, it's hard to listen to the whole album and then do your overall thoughts, and that's the last thing on your mind, in my complete honest opinion.
And that one song takes up half of the album, if in musical in length, overall length. It's overall about 58 minutes, almost an hour, and that one song is 26 minutes. So that's half of the album. And I just think if that track was a lot shorter, or if they did different sections, or did something else with it, I think you're right. Our score would be better. And I do want to give a disclaimer. This is a cat that's on Blue Note Records, one of the essential jazz record labels. Props to him. Props to what he's doing. I find his sound very unique. I don't want to take away from that. And who are we to say certain things that we're saying, without regarding the fact that he's doing great things at such a young age. And I do really respect him for that. I just don't dig musically what's going on in a lot of moments on this album, The Seventh Hand.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that sentiment. I don't think there's no disdain or hate or anything for any of the musicians, and they're all really good. I think our question is with the musical directive that this album takes. That's completely, the way I feel about it. And I do look forward to other stuff that they put out, because I think he is capable of putting out music that I think I would enjoy. So I'm not going to stop listening to Immanuel Wilkins after this. So yeah, and he's on Blue Note, so he knows what he's doing. He's got a following, so yeah, just a little bit different. It's good for us to do something that doesn't speak to us, because it might speak to other people, and you might have a separate opinion. This might be your favorite jazz album that's been put out all year. And if it is, please explain to me why. I want to know.
Send us an email.
Yeah, send us an email, thejazzjampodcast@gmail.com. I would love to know. But, and I respect people's opinion. I expect Immanuel Wilkins, it's his album. But to us, there are these things where it comes short of doing some things musically that we'd want to hear from an album of this kind. So that's our overall thoughts. That's our rating. Let's go ahead and get into our album for next week's episode, which is a classic album. It was going to come up at some point. It was my turn to pick an album. I waited long enough. We're going to be doing the album entitled Night Train by the Oscar Peterson Trio. This one is an absolute banger. It's one of the classic jazz albums, one of the best jazz piano trio albums of all time. It's going to be I've listened to it a billion times, but I'm super, super excited to actually sit down and review it. So yeah, Max, I'm looking forward to next week's episode.
I just wanted to say I knew this album was going to come up at some point, and it'll be a lot of fun to dig into this one with you. I know you're an Oscar Peterson fan, and so am I, and he's just such an essential player, and all the influences you can hear where, he's obviously listened to Art Tatum. Obviously there's an influence from Father Hines and different stuff, and he has influenced so many other people. And there's some great records he's made, and he's made a ton of them. And Night Train is one of those essential Oscar Peterson Trio records to check out. So there's a lot to talk about, and I'm looking forward to that one.
Yeah, out of the hundreds of records that he recorded, this might be his best work. So that's saying a lot, coming from possibly the greatest jazz pianist of all time. So super, super excited to get into this one. Just a few things before we sign off. I want to say we do have an Instagram at the Jazz Jam Podcast. Follow us there. We have a website. Everything's linked in the show notes. So if you want a link to anything, you can get to anything through our website. Make sure to follow us on Instagram and keep up with us. And if you feel like reaching out to us and any kind of review or anything, we'd love to hear that. So the great place to do that is the thejazzjampodcast@gmail.com as well. And so, yeah, I want to thank everyone for listening. I had a lot of fun actually listening to this record. It's really cool to listen to some things that are different and some new cats that are putting out new music. So I did enjoy listening to this record. And, yeah, I look forward to next week's episode. And for Max Levy, I am Dwayne Gunnels, and this has been an episode of the Jazz Jam Podcast.